Hello, good evening, everybody. I am Christiana Limniatis. I'm the Director of Preservation Services for Preservation Buffalo Niagara. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for Peggy Ames' House, Preserving Transgender History in the Rust Belt. Before we get started this evening, let's do a couple housekeeping matters. As you know, we're in webinar format here. And so tonight we're going to be talking about a really interesting topic, and I hope that you have questions or comments on that topic. And so to get those questions and comments to me and my co-presenter Jeffrey tonight, you're going to be using that Q&A function. So if you're new to Zoom, if you just kind of wiggle your mouse around, you'll see that toolbar pop up, and it's that Q&A button is what you're going to want to use for questions that you have for Jeff and I during the presentation. We're going to save all of our questions for the end of the presentation, but certainly put those questions in as they pop into your brain so you don't forget them, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Also here with us tonight to make sure everything goes smoothly is my coworker Tia, who will function as our voice of God, giving us our questions at the end of the presentation. And she's in the comments. That's what I was just going to say. She's going to be manning that chat box as well. So while Jeff and I are talking, if there's links or extra information that go with what you're learning on the screen, she's going to share some convenient links for you in the chat box as well. All righties, and before I introduce my co-presenter tonight, I do just want to take a moment to begin by acknowledging that the land that we are on, that we currently reside on here in Western New York, is original territory to the Seneca Nation, a member of the I just stumbled on it again, and I'm so embarrassed. Haudenosaunee Six Nation Confederacy. We are thankful for the opportunity to live and conduct our work and engage with others in this territory. I am stumbling like crazy today. I apologize. So let me introduce my co-presenter here, Dr. Jeffrey Yovanoni. He is a historian, writer, educator who holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Buffalo. He is a lecturer in history and the coordinator of the Women's and Gender Studies program at SUNY Fredonia. Broadly specializing in gender and Lgbtq studies, Yovanoni's specific areas of focus include multi-ethnic history, American history, Lbgtq history in the United States, US social movements, oral history, and public history. He is currently at work on a book about Buffalo's gay liberation movement entitled Rust to Dreams, Gay Liberation in Buffalo, New York, 1969 to 1984. Dr. Jeff. Welcome.
Well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to get to introduce you as my colleague and friend. So Christiana Limniatis is the Director of Preservation Services at Preservation Buffalo Niagara, or PBN, obviously in Buffalo, New York. So at PBN, Christiana oversees all technical and community services, which work to expand and strengthen the reach of preservation education and best practices in Western New York. Originally from Albany, she began her preservation career at Historic Albany Foundation and has also worked as a preservation consultant in Louisiana and Tennessee. She holds a BA in History and Political Science from the College of St. Rose and completed her coursework towards an MA in Historic Preservation Planning at Cornell University.
Yay, thank you. And with that, we will just get into our presentation. Starting us off is going to be Jeffrey.
So I'm really excited to get to talk to everyone about Peggy Ames and to share more of her story. And of course, we're going to bring in the specific focus of her connection to her home and how that related to her advocacy. So Peggy Ames was an early transgender activist and advocate from Western New York, in particular Clarence Center. She began her career in the 1970s as part of the emerging gay liberation movement and also the increased public awareness of trans identities in the United States at the time. And though she's largely unknown, if we're looking at the kind of broad mainstream narrative of transgender history and transgender rights, She certainly influenced, right, the advancement of this movement and both acceptance on a local and a national level. And really some of the work that she did helped to lay the foundation for the contemporary movements that we see today, specifically in terms of trans rights, but also LGBTQ people and also feminism. And most importantly, I mean, she was someone who was working outside of a big coastal city like New York City and San Francisco. And so she had to do things differently, right? Working in a Rust Belt city like Buffalo, and also a rural community like Clarence. And so her life and her work gives us a different perspective on trans activism, particularly in the 1970s. So Ames was born in 1921 in Buffalo, New York, and was identified as male at birth. But she says in her personal writings, around the age of 12 or so, she starts to have a sense that she's different in some way. She's taking and dressing in her mother's and her sister's clothes. She's borrowing their cosmetics. She enrolls in college, so Westminster College in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania, and she tries to, go the typical masculine route. She joins a fraternity. She attempts to fit in with her peers. It's also in college that she meets her future wife, Gladys. And the pair marries and they have a child, David, before Ames is drafted into the Air Force during World War II. She's honorably discharged a year after she enters the service, and she ends up completing dual degrees in business and psychology at the University of Buffalo. She and Gladys open an insurance business, and they have 3 more children, Cynthia, Marcia, and Daryl. So one of the things that Ames says in her writing is that on the surface, right, her family appears to be this happy, successful family. They were very involved in their community, but she felt like she was living a dual existence. And in particular, when she would travel for business trips, she presented as male, but then when she was alone and she had some time to herself, she would be Peggy. And it's around this time in the 1950s when she starts following the story of, oops, and what did I do? Sorry about that. She starts following the story of Christine Jorgensen in the media. And if you haven't heard of Christine Jorgensen before, she's considered the first trans celebrity, before we have people like Laverne Cox and Janet Mock, and maybe we would even include Caitlyn Jenner in here, maybe not. But she really helps to bring the concept of sex change to the forefront of American consciousness, in particular in 1952, when she arrives back to the United States after she has transitioned in Denmark, and the New York Daily News, right, runs a story with this headline: XGI becomes blonde beauty, operations transform Bronx youth. And like Peggy, Christine Jorgensen had also served in World War II and was a veteran. And she really functions as a role model for other trans women at the time, so like Peggy, to better understand themselves, to think that medical transition was an option for them, to pursue that course of action. However, Ames noted that though some people celebrated Jorgensen's transition, at one point she was, I think we could argue, one of the most famous or well-known people in the world. Other people essentially saw her as a freak of nature. And so, right, that confirmed Ames's suspicion that the 1950s, right, are not necessarily a great time to be her true self. So she chose to remain closeted. And so I'm gonna pause here or digress a bit in terms of situating Ames's story in relation to the larger context of transgender history in the United States, in particular, transgender activism. So I'm going to, give us like a 5-minute US trans history lesson. And so really, if we're looking at trans activism in the US, it really starts around 1952, both because of Jorgensen and also because of another trans woman, Louise Lawrence, who was from California, right, who at the time in the 1950s is doing public lectures in California, in particular LA and San Francisco, talking about early trans issues, and then also in 1952, with some other women, she helps to found a publication called Transvestia, which is essentially the first trans magazine. And at the time, they defined it as a magazine for transvestites, but they were using that word, at least initially, when they founded the publication, in a much more expansive way than we might understand that term today in terms of being solely focused on quote unquote cross-dressing. And if you're interested in looking at some issues of transvestia, there's a great resource online called the Digital Transgender Archive, and you can find some of the issues there. So here's a basic timeline of important events in US transgender history. So we talked about Jorgensen and Lawrence. One of the things that, other things that we see from the late 1950s leading up to the late 1960s is increased militancy and advocacy in the community, and actually some early riots and uprisings that occur before Stonewall that were largely led by trans people. So for example, Cooper's Donuts riot that occurred in Los Angeles. In 1964, we see an organization being founded that's dealing with, in part, trans issues called the Erickson Educational Foundation that I'll talk more about in a minute because it overlaps with Peggy's story. In 1965, due to growing awareness of trans identity, we start to see clinics opening up, in particular, big research universities. For example, the first one opens at Johns Hopkins in 1965 that are actually treating and helping trans individuals medically transition. In 1966, we also get another trans-led uprising in response to police brutality in the Tenderloin district in San Francisco at Compton's cafeteria. And that same year, we also see the publication of Dr. Harry Benjamin, who was an endocrinologist, pioneer in working with trans patients. We see the publication of his book, The Transsexual Phenomenon, which essentially outlined a path of care for trans people who wanted to medically transition, which brings even more attention to the issue. In 1969, of course, we have the Stonewall Uprising in Greenwich Village in New York City. And then afterwards, we start to see more trans organizations being founded. An example of that would be Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries in New York City, founded in 1970, and I'll talk more about that as well. In 1977, Renee Richards, a trans tennis player, competes in the US Open in the women's category after she sues the United States Tennis Association, and the New York State Supreme Court decides that under the state gender anti-discrimination laws, she can compete as a woman. In 1986, in San Francisco, Lou Sullivan, who's a trans man, founds FTM International, which is the first organization specifically looking at trans men and trans masculine people. Then by the 1990s, the term transgender, our modern understanding of it, starts to be popularized. And so that represents a new wave of trans activism in the US. And then we have our current wave, or our current moment that we're in, that some people have pinpointed as starting in 2013, when the actress and activist Laverne Cox appears on the cover of Time magazine with the headline, "The Transgender Tipping Point." Right? So that's where we are right now. Right? So I think it's important to have that kind of broad understanding to understand specifically where Ames's story intersects with this broader narrative of transgender history. Okay, so to go back to Peggy and her story, it wasn't actually until 1973 that she heard and learned the word transsexual, and that's kind of like when everything clicked into place for her. She had better understanding, right, of who she was and these things that she was feeling, that she describes as incessant, continual, obsessional, and always intensifying. However, it's that same year that Gladys, her wife, discovers her at home dressed as Peggy. And so in some ways, this was both a blessing and a curse for her. She was outed. So she decided that because she was now, her identity was now out, she was going to live full-time as who she was, but it also dramatically changed her life. So the couple initially discussed living together platonically as two women, but Gladys was deeply religious, and she had a hard time reconciling the fact that Peggy also identified as a lesbian. Her children took the news even harder, and she talks in her personal writings a lot about how she felt they cut her out of their lives and how hurtful that was to her. And so as part of their divorce agreement, she got to retain their home, the family home, at 9500 Clarence Center Road, where she's pictured here. And Gladys became the sole owner of their business, the Dietrich Insurance Agency. And as a result of not being involved any longer in the family business, losing her source of income, and when she starts transitioning, being rejected by the community, she struggles to financially support herself for the remainder of her life. And she actually ends up opening a furniture refinishing business, in which she also restored antiques as well, that she called Pine Crafts, Pyne, that she operated out of a barn that was located at the back of her property. And she also taught adult education courses on woodworking. And so after consulting with doctors at the Harry Benjamin Foundation in New York City, she underwent sex reassignment in 1974. And interestingly, she had the same doctors as Renee Richards, although Richards, Peggy transitions first, and then Richards transitions shortly after. But right, this is an interesting point of connection because Renee Richards' story was so public, right? We can look to kind of her story and her experience to give us some insight into Peggy's life at the time in terms of her transition. And in particular, Richards wrote a memoir that was called Second Serve. And so in her personal writings around this time, Ames notes that she admired other trans women who were in the public spotlight, like Christine Jorgensen and Renee Richards, but she had to forge her own path because she was living in a rural community. And so her experiences were different from theirs in significant ways in terms of the challenges that she faced and her path to acceptance. And she really realized that if she just stayed quiet or closeted or didn't do anything, this wasn't going to advance a path for acceptance in Western New York, either for herself, right, or other people who were like her, because she certainly realized that there had to be other trans people in Western New York, even if they weren't out. So in terms of her local advocacy, in 1970, she joined the Managing Society of the Niagara Frontier, which was Buffalo's first gay and lesbian civil rights organization. She was actually the secretary of the organization in 1973 and 1974. And significantly, she also participated in the organization's peer counselor training program. And she also organized some of the first public events on transsexualism for Buffalo's annual Gay Pride Week in June. And she was also on the organization's Speakers Bureau. In 1978, the newspaper, the Buffalo Courier Express, wrote a profile of her. And in that profile, she estimated that by that time, she had lectured to around 12,000 people in New York about trans issues. Including medical and nursing students, psychology students at the University of Buffalo, other area campuses and medical centers. She lectured at the VA hospital in Buffalo, and also right to just regular people. Her advocacy, though, also had national reach. And in 1973, she became involved in the counseling programs that were offered within the gender identity unit of the psychoendocrinology clinic at Buffalo Women's and Children's Hospital. And I will admit I had to look up what psychoendocrinology was, right? And it's basically like the study of how hormones influence our behavior or our psychological makeup. Now, this clinic, right, which is a part of the broader creation of clinics throughout the country that are addressing a variety of gender issues, was established by two psychologists, Doctors Anki Earhart, who's featured here, and her husband at the time, Heino Meyer-Ballberg. They were two clinical psychologists who were originally from Germany, and they came to the US to study under Dr. John Money, at Johns Hopkins University, right, where there was the first gender clinic. And he was, at the time, he was a leader in the study of gender identity and transsexualism. And some of his ideas were very forward thinking and are still relevant today. Others have fallen out of fashion. So for example, if you look more into John Money, you might encounter his theory of optimal gender rearing. So one of his theories was that to a certain age in childhood, that gender identity, or what we today would call gender identity, was basically malleable, so that you could, right, take a child of any sex and rear them as a particular gender, and they would adopt to that role. And there was a famous case of his, it was called the Joan John case, where essentially it was two twin boys, and one of the twins essentially had his penis burned off in a botched circumcision. And the family was directed to John Money and Johns Hopkins, and his suggestion was, okay, raise the child that had the botched circumcision as a girl, and then, right, he'll adopt to that feminine role. Of course, that ended up being a disaster, right? Didn't work. and shows that, right, there's an aspect of gender in terms of our, right, psychological conception of who we are that isn't entirely malleable. And in a strange roundabout way, it actually gives validity and legitimacy, right, to trans identity. And if you're interested in reading more about this theory in that case, there's a really excellent book that's called As Nature Made Him by the journalist John Colapinto that talks all about this Joan John case. So Ames was actually a frequent lecturer alongside Earhart when she was going out and educating medical students in New York State about transsexualism. However, the gender identity unit at Women's and Children's Hospital ceased operation in 1977 because Earhart and Meyer Ballberg relocated to Columbia University. And when they do this, Ames takes matters into her own hands in terms of trans advocacy in Western New York. And what she does is she becomes an established contact person for the Erickson Educational Foundation. And later, when the Erickson Educational Foundation folds in 1977, it becomes another organization called the Janus Information Facility. And so she becomes a contact person for this organization that she in part knew of from the clinic at Women's and Children's. So Anki Earhart was on the board of the Erickson Educational Foundation. That clinic was in part funded by the foundation, and Anki and other doctors within the clinic also got funding from the organization to conduct some of the first research into trans identity. So the EEF was established in 1964 by the independently wealthy trans man Reed Erickson, who's pictured here. And it becomes the leading organization to fund research into transsexualism and to provide information and support to trans people in need of guidance. And the goals, or the stated goals of the organization, were to provide assistance and support in areas where human potential was limited by adverse physical, mental, or social conditions, or where the scope of research was too new, controversial, or imaginative to receive traditionally oriented support, right? So, okay, like what does that exactly mean and what did they do? The Erickson Educational Foundation had three primary areas of focus. So first, it funded early gay organizations. For example, the organization One Incorporated, which was founded in Los Angeles, California. Secondly, they provided funding for what today we might refer to as like New Age spiritual ventures, right? So like meditation, dolphin communication. The EEF actually publishes the New Age spiritual text, A Course in Miracles. But most importantly, right, was their funding to provide support for research into transsexualism and to providing support for trans people. And Erickson himself, was quite an interesting and colorful figure. So I don't want to erase his story in talking about the organization. He was born in El Paso, Texas on October 13th of 1917. He grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And his family owns this lead smelting business. He attends Louisiana State University and earns a degree in mechanical engineering. And in 1962, right, he inherits the family business and runs it successfully until he sells it at the end of the decade for several $1 million. He was also a patient of Harry Benjamin beginning in 1963. And he had a very colorful and interesting life, although he's somewhat of an elusive figure. We don't really have personal writings of his or videotape or audio. But he eventually amasses a fortune of around $40 million. He had a pet leopard named Henry, who's pictured here. And later in life, he moved to Southern California, although sadly by the time of his death in 1992, at the age of 74, he had become addicted to illegal drugs and actually died in Mexico as a fugitive from drug indictments in the United States, right? So quite an interesting story. And it's interesting to think about how his trans identity may have intersected in ways with the colorful life that he lived and some of the difficulties that he may have experienced. Oh. So although Reed Erickson was the backer of the EEF, the woman that ran the day-to-day operations of the organization was named Zelda R. Saplee, or Zelda Roth Saplee, and she essentially ran the day-to-day functioning of the EEF. And so often trans people would reach out to the office for support, and it was often Zelda Saplee that they corresponded with. And in fact, there's correspondence in Peggy Ames's papers between her and Saplee. Zelda Saplee was also a colorful and interesting character, and she was a practicing nudist. She also ran several nudist colonies, and she was the first full frontal centerfold in Playboy magazine in black and white, right? So quite an interesting woman, but I think most importantly, is the work that she did, the early work that she did to help trans people. And so the EEF, right, maintained contact lists of resources. And so what that would look like, right, is trans people could reach out to the organizations and then they could be put in touch with local resources. Now, most of these resources were medical and health professionals. However, there were some fledgling trans organizations that were listed on the contact referral list, primarily in New York City and San Francisco. And then there was Peggy Ames, who got herself listed, right, as a contact person for the EEF. I think in large part because she had been involved with the clinic at Women's and Children's, and she was also trained as a peer counselor. So trans people from the Western New York area who were contacting the EEF or Janus when it transitioned into that were often referred to Ames for peer counseling and transition-related guidance. And one of the other things that the EEF does is they've created and provided a variety of different informational pamphlets for trans people, for medical professionals, and for the families of trans people. And so we know from correspondence between Ames and the EEF that she actually, after the clinic folded at Children's, was running an EEF established counseling service out of her home. And sometimes she would also provide shelter for trans women who are in need of temporary living accommodations and counseling people over the phone. And she says in her correspondence to the EEF that trans women are calling her every day looking for support, right? And she wouldn't have been able to do this work if she didn't have her house. And so her using, her relationship with the organization, her using her home this way is kind of like a proto trans service center in Western New York is unique for the time period, right? And so despite some of the harassment and the ostracism that she faced from people in the community, her house really afforded her the ability to provide guidance and support for fellow trans people. And I think this quote from the transgender historian Abram J. Lewis really captures and summarizes what Peggy Ames was doing. And he says, speaking about trans activism in the 70s in particular, it's important to note, however, that precisely because trans communities were barred from major reform efforts, the strategies they developed to support their lives and work often occurred outside of formal organizations. At times, these strategies do not look like conventional activism at all. Even before relations with gays and feminists became fraught, trans activists prioritized self-determination within their own communities. And rather than seeking access to dominant support structures, informal survival services and mutual aid were priorities, right? Which is exactly what Peggy Ames was doing with her house through this relationship that she establishes with the Erickson Educational Foundation. And of course, what Lewis cites as an example of this is Star House, which was in New York City. And so STAR, as I mentioned, or Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, was an early trans organization founded in New York City in 1970 by Sylvia Rivera, who's pictured there on the left holding the banner. They're marching in Christopher Street Liberation Day in 1973, and also Marsha P. Johnson. And they also established this house, and thank you to the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project for documenting this. And I highly recommend checking out their website because they have a fantastic post about Star House. But essentially, it was this building that was located, tenement building located at 213 East 2nd Street in the East Village in New York City, where they were essentially trying to do something similar to Ames, or right, where we could say Ames was doing something similar to them in terms of providing like an early shelter, an early services organization. And it's important to note here, right, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson as two trans women of color who are also sex workers who didn't have a lot of economic resources, weren't really able to turn Star House into what it could have been because they weren't able to get broader financial support from the gay and lesbian community at the time, where, I think it's important to note that Peggy, as before she transitioned, is a white middle-class person, right, was able to retain her home. And if she didn't have that resource, she wouldn't have been able to do some of the work that she did. And so on that note, I'm going to turn things over to Christy, who's going to talk to us more specifically about the Peggy Ames house.
Excellent, thank you. So next, you can turn to the next slide. Excellent. There is this lovely house that we are talking about, again, located in the town of Clarence, in the hamlet of Clarence Center, because we can't say the word Clarence enough. It was built around 1835. It's a two-story Greek revival style residence, and it has that contributing barn. This is a older photograph of the barn. It's slightly been remodeled recently. At the time of its construction, it's located in a tiny community. Again, the hamlet of Clarence Center, there's only about 50 buildings, and having only been settled by white settlers about 30 years earlier. While a sleepy farming community in what was seen as America's wild frontier, this area was actually fairly busy, seeing many visitors on the road as they were situated, and specifically this house is situated on one of the main access points to the city of Buffalo, and then obviously any points west in the newly purchased western portion of the United States. We say around 1835 as the construction date because due to pandemic-related shutdowns, we haven't been able to access some of the documents we need to truly confirm that construction date. We do have a 2009 survey of the town, which says it was built in 1835, but it doesn't provide any more details or clarification of how that date was confirmed. These photographs are from that 2009 survey. But we also have a letter written by Peggy herself, where she's explaining how much she loves her house, but also how much research she had done into her house. And so based on that letter, she tells us that she was able to date it to 1821. Unfortunately, she didn't leave notes of the actual research in her papers. So we're still working on following her footsteps in that research. While we might not have confirmed the actual construction date, we do know that the original white owners of that land that the house is on was the Regal family, and they were likely the builders of the home. They were a prominent early settling family of Clarence Center. After that family sold the property in the mid 1800s, the house only changed hands about 4 times before Peggy and her then wife Gladys purchased the property in 1954. Next. Here on the next slide, you can see the earliest maps in which we find the property. We have the 1866 atlas, which just has little simple squares denoting where the properties are, but you see where the arrows pointing, that's our beautiful Peggy house. And then the 1880 and the 1909 atlases go a little bit further and attempt to actually outline the true layout, the footprint of that building that we see there. These maps not only generally confirm and document not only the existence of the property, but also help us confirm the evolution of the site. So that first map, again, only has simple squares denoting where the properties are. Those next two do try to outline a true footprint of the property. And so we can tell based on those that, and feel pretty confident in saying that the house probably has not had significant alterations to it since about the 1880s. Next slide. When we look at the house and comparing to those footprints on those maps, we can see that the residence is actually divided into 3 building campaigns. So the main block of the house is going to be this 2-story section here with the prominent gable wall chimney. The second block is going to be this side wing on the main block that features this 1-story full width porch. When I say full width, I mean that the porch is taking up the full width of that elevation. So it's a nice big porch right there. And then the third block of the house is on the rear of that second block, which is just a simple 1.5-story addition there. So again, when we kind of figure out that layout of the additions and the building campaigns on it, we can see that it's pretty much lines up exactly with how these footprints are in these maps. When we talk about multiple building campaigns, it's very common of buildings of this age, and especially with Greek Revival style buildings in a rural setting, to have multiple building campaigns. Why would that be? Well, as I said in the beginning of this, this community is basically the Wild West of America. When the people that settled Clarence Center in this part of Erie County, many of them are going to be German immigrants who were originally living in Pennsylvania. We now refer to them as the Pennsylvania Dutch. So that community and many Mennonites are who travel up to Clarence and settle that area. So we're talking about people who have spent weeks, if not months, in carriages traveling there. When they get there, they're not prepared to come out swinging and build their McMansion dream house right away. They have to build something small and modest to keep them safe. And then as conditions and finances allow, you're going to see that expansion and you'll see those multiple building campaigns. I did just see in the question and answer section about the chimney, and that is also important to note that as the building campaigns happen, you're also going to see elements added into that building that aren't necessarily Greek Revival style things, but are more common to the later eras of architecture. And so especially on this main block here, this style of chimney and this oriel window, this bay window that are there are much more design-wise similar to elements that you'd see in the Victorian era. So definitely think that those things were added on later and not necessarily original to its 1830s-ish construction period time. Next slide. So as I said, it's a Greek Revival style Building Greek Revival style in America, it is the dominant domestic architectural style in the United States from the first half of the 19th century. We see examples of it as early as the 1820s and as late as the 1860s. You are going to find Greek Revival style buildings in any part of America that was settled by 1860s. That's how dominant this style was. Again, it was so popular that in that moment, it was actually referred to as the national style. It's not until later that architectural historians look at this and rebrand it and repackage it as Greek Revival style. So here on the screen, you can see listed out those common characteristics that we find in Greek Revival buildings. We're going to have most often low pitched roofs. So that steep angle of the roof is going to be lower on Greek Revival homes. The cornice line is going to be emphasized with wide divided bands of trim. And we can see that here very clearly on the main block of the house, where we have this frieze panel, this wide band of trim right underneath the roof line. Most Greek Revival style homes have either an entry or a full width porch, and you're going to see lots of columns and pilasters. Columns are going to be obviously freestanding, so you'd be able to hug that column if you wanted to, where pilasters are a column that's been cut in half or a faux column that's inlaid into the actual wall of the building. So we can see that here on the corner of the main block of the building where we have these column details added. When we talk about Greek Revival style homes, we're also going to note that they're going to have odd ranking of their windows. And so I've added these little red dotted lines to help explain what ranking means. Ranking is going to be the number of, columns of window pattern or windows or door openings. And so as I said briefly before, this bay window is definitely going to be a later addition, something that was added on during the Victorian era. Before that bay window was added, it was probably either two windows in that spot, or potentially an entryway would have been in one of those windows. We need more research to be able to confirm that. But that divide, having those dividing lines there, you can see how that side of the building is three ranked. It had three columns of windows. And then again, as I mentioned before, Greek Revival style, you're going to have a lot of examples where there's added wings or also things called hyphens, little connecting pieces to a larger addition later on. So you're definitely going to see multiple building campaigns in Greek Revival style houses. Next slide. So our work to identify and promote the story of Peggy Ames doesn't just stop there. It's not enough to just document it. It's important for us to take those necessary steps to protect this resource for future generations. As Jeff explained, it's in this house that Peggy is able to become her true self. It's at this house that she begins and conducts her groundbreaking advocacy and outreach work. So how do we protect resources? The path to protection is going to be different for every resource, right? So it's going to be depending on their own history, their location, any issues when it comes to endangerment or threatening that resource. But most often, the first step that's taken is getting listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register is the federal government's official listing of historic resources deemed worthy for preservation for their historic significance. Worthy for preservation is bolded on the screen for a reason. It's not just because, it's not enough to have history, because everything can have history. We've colonized this land for over 200 years now. We can identify historic things that are associated with all of our resources. So it's not just enough to have history to get on the National Register. It's that you need to be worthy of preservation. You need to have a level of integrity, a level of physical authenticity that relates to what makes it significant. So if you're saying that this building is significant because it's a Greek Revival style building, we need to have authenticity of those decorative elements that make it Greek Revival. If we're saying that this resource is significant because of its connection to Peggy, we need to show and document that there's an integrity, there's a physical authenticity to that space, to how it was when she occupied that space. So the integrity aspect is really important. The other major thing to understand about the National Register is that it is honorary. It is not regulatory. Listing in the National Register of Historic Places does not give the federal government the ability to regulate your resource in any way. So you could theoretically get listed today and tomorrow write a check to get the building demolished, and the federal government really can't do anything about it, right? So while this designation does not provide legal protection of a resource, the reason it's usually the first step in protecting a resource is because National Register status is what opens the door to financial incentives that you can use to further protect and promote your resource. So for private property owners, that means access to historic tax credits, depending on other eligibility requirements. And then for nonprofit property owners, that means accessing the various grants that exist that require National Register listing as an eligibility requirement. On the next slide, you'll see that to be considered eligible for the National Register, you have to meet at least one of the National Register criteria for evaluation. So this involves examining the property's age, its significance, its integrity, and then based on all of that information, needing to assess which of these criteria it meets. So criterion A is relates to sites that have significance due to its association to historic events. Whether individual singular events or maybe a series of events and historic trends. Criterion B relates to sites that have significance due to association with significant people, either individuals or groups. Criterion C relates to sites that have significance due to their architecture, engineering, or their physical artistic elements. And then criterion D relates to sites that have significance due to their known or believed connection to history or prehistory and adding to the archaeological record. So criteria D really focuses on archaeological resources. For each of these criteria, the National Park Service has created listings of categories and subcategories to help further define how a resource meets that criteria. So when you're in this field and doing this work, it's not simply that, oh, it meets criteria A. You need to then further evaluate what are the subcategories of criteria A that this resource also falls under. How do we learn about that, and how do we, get the nuances of how to apply these criteria? On the next slide, you'll see that the lovely people at the National Park Service has created a series of publications to do that exactly. And so here are 3 of the National Register bulletins that have been produced by the National Park Service that help you through the National Register process. And these 3 are the ones that are most relevant to Jeff and I that we are using in our process of evaluating this property and hopefully listing it onto the National Register. On the left-hand side, you'll see National Register Bulletin number 15, which is how to apply the National Register criteria for evaluation. So this is going to go into much more detail about what each of those criteria mean and how to apply that significance, and then explanation of those subcategories. On the right-hand side, you'll see bulletin number 16A, which is how to complete the National Register form. A National Register application, the form that you submit to list things on the National Register, is an actual form. It includes, several narrative sections. You have to write a full description of the property and a full history of the significance. But there's an actual application form, and it's a lot of check boxes and fill in the blanks. And so that bulletin walks you through that application form and explains how to fill in those blanks. Because again, you have people from all over the country trying to describe the building materials on that building, trying to describe architectural styles. And so we want to make sure that we're all using the same search terms and keywords so that all of our National Register nominations are kind of speaking the same language, right? And then that guide in the middle is National Bulletin number 22, which is guidelines for evaluating and nominating properties that have achieved significance within the last 50 years. There is a general rule of thumb that properties and or their significance associated needs to be at least 50 years old to be listed on the National Register. Now, that's not because things younger than 50 years old can't be deemed eligible. They can totally be eligible. It's just that compared to something that a resource that is 200 years old, for that resource, we've had enough time to fully study that significance and to fully get into all of the details of the influences that created that significance or that resource and how that resource or significance impacted others. And so then for newer resources, we just really haven't had that historic time to be able to fully evaluate it. So it just means that we need this bulletin and we need further guidance to help us evaluate those newer circumstances so that we are properly evaluating them, that we're placing them correctly in the broader historic context. And that's obviously the case with Peggy Ames. We are still living in the age of trans activism and advocacy. Peggy only passed away 21 years ago. We are still living in the time of Peggy. So to evaluate her significance and the house's significance, we need a little extra guidance from National Park Service to make sure that we are placing her correctly in the broader historic context. To further help professionals through this type of process, the National Park Service has also prepared documents that are called historic context statements or theme studies. And so theme studies provide a national historic context for specific topics so you can better understand them. So it kind of provides that baseline narrative of whatever that topic is, this is how it happened on a national level, so that you can then figure out how your resource plays into that theme. And so important to us as we work on Peggy is the Lbgtq theme study that was created. It's titled LGBTQ America. It was released in 2016. And again, this document explores the legacy of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer individuals and their associated sites, and how their associated sites can be recognized, preserved, interpreted for future generations. This theme study has 32 chapters that were written and peer-reviewed by experts in LGBTQ studies and was released on National Coming Out Day on October 11th, 2016. So this is a great resource for not just us in our work, but anyone working in LGBTQ preservation. On the next slide. So I just went through what those 4 criteria are, right? So as Jeff and I are researching and going on our path to nominate, hopefully, this property to the National Register, we needed to evaluate and come to our suggested, our conclusion on what criteria this house meets. And so in our research and our communications with the State Historic Preservation Office, which I'll talk about in a second, based on our research, we contend that the Peggy Ames house is significant under criterion A. For its association to social history and the LGBTQ history during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And then also we find that it meets criteria B for its connection to Peggy Ames as the activist and advocate whose influence on, I can read today, this is just really silly right now, whose influence advanced transgender rights and accepted on both a local, state, and national level. So we definitely feel that the research and the documentation support that this resource is eligible under criteria A and criteria B. Next slide. As I said, there's also criteria C, which relates to architecture. And I think, again, it's definitely a fine example of Greek revival style architecture, but to be able to really confidently say that it does meet criteria C, we still need to do, dot our I's and cross our T's or backwards the other way, and make sure that we have all of those early documents that confirm its construction date and confirm that earliest history of that building. So right now, we don't necessarily feel comfortable claiming that it meets criteria C, but once we have access to all of those documents, when more libraries and research centers are opened, we do feel confident that we'll have that documentation to also put forth that it meets criteria C. So on the next slide, you can see the general process for listing something on the National Register, because again, that is kind of our end goal. We want to give Peggy, for all of her significance and importance, this is definitely an honor that this house and Peggy deserve. So the National Register nominating process, it's a little bit different in every state. So if you are watching us tonight from someplace that's not in New York, every state kind of operates this process differently. But here in New York, what has to happen first is that you need to have a conversation with the State Historic Preservation Office, which is within the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. We for short call them SHPO, so that's what I'm going to call them for the rest of this conversation. So you need to have a conversation with SHPO to evaluate and determine the eligibility of that resource. So what that involves is us as the submission, as the consultant, as the person working on that project, to submit what in effect is a baby National Register nomination, provide the key information about that significance and the history of that resource and our arguments as to why it meets the various criteria. That's then evaluated by the staff at SHPO, and then they either agree with you and issue a report stating that, yes, we believe it's eligible under these criteria and for these reasons, or if they don't agree, they'll issue a report explaining why they don't think it meets those criteria. Once you've secured eligibility and you have that report on file, then you can start that actual nomination process and filling out that report and writing all of your narrative descriptions about the architecture and the history of that building. That process is definitely a collaborative one with SHPO. This is New York State's history. This is our nation's history. We want to make sure that the document is as accurate as possible, as portraying the history as authentically as possible. So the SHPO office definitely works with you to make sure that that nomination is the best it can be. Once it's become the best it can be, it will get approved internally by the staff and then sent to one of the quarterly state review boards, where a committee that's made up of representatives from across the state, governor appointed representatives from across the state, who review nominations for addition to the state register of historic places. If it's approved and accepted and put onto the state register, then that nomination is forwarded to the National Park Service, where they'll go under a similar review process to be added to the National Register of Historic Places. On the next slide, just for reference, I wanted to show you guys what a determination of eligibility looks like. So once you've submitted all of that information to the state, they'll issue a report. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So here's an example of that report that they would issue. This one is one that was recently issued for a church complex here in the city of Buffalo. Again, just for reference, wanting you guys to see what this form looks like. So it's, they have like a spot where you can put maps and pictures on it. But in that document, they will, again, confirm that they think it's eligible for the state or national register. They confirm which of those criteria they think that it is eligible under. And then on the next slide, you'll see that they'll include kind of a summary of what that history is. And then this history that they include in this resource evaluation is kind of your roadmap to completing that National Register nomination, that this is the summary, and your National Register nomination needs to expand upon this history and explain all of the nitty-gritty details outlined in this paragraph. Next slide. And so we are, like I said, Jeffrey and I believe that this property is eligible for the National Register, and we wish to, give this resource and Peggy the notoriety and acclaim and designation that I think they deserve. Where we are currently in our process is that we have completed and submitted to SHPO our determination of eligibility package. So that includes a full history of the property that we have right now. They are currently reviewing that for eligibility. So we hope to hear from SHPO in the near future. We've also reached out to the property owner. As you saw on a couple of slides earlier, the National Register, while it does not have a regulatory function, it does require owner approval to be listed on the National Register. So for us to be able to move forward with that process, we do need owner support. So we have reached out to that owner and look forward to communication in the future. Next slide. Do I have a next slide? Oh, yes. So in this, I just wanted to, again, kind of touch on the broader scope of Lbgtq resources listed in the National Register. When that 2016 theme study was released, there were only 10 Lbgtq sites designated as either National Historic Landmarks or on the National Register. And when we say only 10 were listed, we mean there were only 10 that were listed specifically because of their Lbgtq history. There are certainly many sites listed on the National Register that are associated with Lbgtq history, but that history might not be included in that actual nomination paperwork. So here are those 10 sites that were listed at that time. As Jeff already gave a shout out to the New York City LGBT History Sites Project, they are leading the nation, not just here in New York State, but leading the nation in getting sites listed to the National Register for Lbgtq history. So definitely highly recommend going to their website. They are also the organization that many of us working in this field, look to and try to emulate, because it is a really really good website where you can navigate all the different sites in New York City associated with this history. So yeah, definitely check them out. While there were only 10 in 2016, that number is slowly growing. New York State in the lead because of our friends in New York City and all of their work. But I think I just saw on the internet yesterday, the day before, I think it was Florida had just announced that they had determined a new LBGTQ site eligible for the National Register. I think it was their first site that was deemed eligible specifically for LGBTQ history. So excellent, more and more communities doing this research to expand and get more things listed. And with that, I think that is my last slide, and it'll be back to Jeff. Ta-da.
So to bring things back around to Peggy and her story, to conclude our presentation for this evening, I think it's also really important to talk about this historic resource and to preserve it, because it gives us an opportunity also to think about transgender history differently and to also incorporate it into our national narrative and our story that we tell about ourselves and who we are. And so Peggy certainly experienced a lot of harassment in her life and rejection. But I think we would be mistaken if we came away from her story and learning about her, just seeing her as a victim, right? And so maybe some of you that are from Buffalo are familiar with the documentary film Swimming with Lesbians that was made by a filmmaker from Rochester, David B. Marshall, which examines the creation of the Mellon Davis LGBTQ archive of Western New York, which is now housed at SUNY Buffalo State. And this is where Peggy's papers are. And so the documentary, in part, tells her story, but very much represents her as, right, someone who was a victim, who just experienced horrible discrimination, who could never fit in, who essentially, right, had a horrible life. Nothing about her advocacy and the work that she did. And well, certainly, I think the Mellon Davis archive and the history that it holds, right, needs more attention and focus. When I look at Peggy Ames's material, the story that I see is not the story that David Marshall tells. And I wanted to share this extract from one of her letters to a lesbian friend of hers who actually lived in Fredonia, which is where I teach. And I'm not going to read it aloud, but you can see her talking about the horrible things that she was called and the way that people treated her, and the police wouldn't help her. And people essentially telling her, right, everyone tells me the only solution is to sell. But she didn't sell. She loved her house. She saw it as a piece of who she was. And she found a way to make things work and move things forward in terms of trans advocacy in Western New York, despite experiencing what she describes here in this letter, right? And she could do that in large part because she had her house, and that provided a way that she could continue her advocacy while also, right, having a safe place and minimizing harassment and discrimination. And Julia Serrano, the transgender activist and writer, says that there's two primary ways that we represent trans women's stories. They're either represented as pathetic or deceptive, right? So the pathetic trans woman is the trans woman who can, never fit in. She doesn't quote unquote pass. She doesn't conform to standards of appearance for women or femininity. She's a perpetual outsider. And then the deceptive trans woman is the trans woman who, right, does fit in, is read in the world as a woman, but then is also, right, criticized for that because she's seen as deceiving and not being honest about, right, who she truly is. And these narratives are both like a zero-sum game, right? Because no matter what a trans woman does, she's criticized. And David Marshall very much represents Peggy Ames in this pathetic narrative. And I think that that's incorrect. That's not the story that I see when I look at her life and her work and what she did. And so also documenting this resource gives us an opportunity to correct that narrative and tell a different story about who she was and how trans history is represented, right, in our national story, and especially to represent some of that history and that story that is in a place like Buffalo or Clarence and not a big city on the coast. And Peggy passed away in 2000 at the age of 79. But through her stubborn persistence, right? That's really how I would describe her. Not someone who is a victim, but someone who is stubborn and persistent. She paved the way for future generations of trans and gender nonconforming people, not only in Western New York, but also beyond, right? And though her name as of yet doesn't appear in our mainstream narrative of trans history, I would argue that we should see her as one of the founding mothers of our contemporary trans rights movement. And I want to end with a quote from her personal writings where she's talking about her relationship to her house. And this is a picture of her in her craft shop that I mentioned. She says, anyone who has lived in an old house, desired so intensely to restore it, will both revel and sympathize with me at all of the challenge and the heartache, coupled with the costs and problems that go into such an effort. Nevertheless, that was exactly what we started out to do. Pick up from the folks from whom we purchased, had stopped when they had to move due to a business transfer, and finish a dream. Now this home represents an extension of me, my personality, and my work. Folks who visit near immediately react to these forces. They often exclaim how warm, hospitable, and much like me, my interests and the comfortableness the entire house projects. It loses its house-like character and becomes a part of the occupant. So we will conclude there. I would love to answer people's questions.
And I'm sitting here literally tearing up right now because that is super sweet, but also unbeknownst kind of to Jeff, because I think he was actually focusing on the presentation and speaking, but we do have family members of Peggy joining us tonight who have shared some really wonderful tidbits and corrections, frankly, to some little things, which we'll make sure we get to Jeff. As we responded to the questions in there, you know, all of our information that we have about Peggy, about the house, is based on the resources and documents that are available to us. So we have her records at the Madeline Davis Archive, so we're able to, you know, use her words, but those are only some of the documents that she had over her life. It's not the full, complete history of her there. So obviously always looking for clarification and further information. But one of the last things that was shared was that the chair in that photograph that she posed with is actually in the possession of one of these family members. So like I'm sitting here crying, reading that very wonderful information that you're sharing with us. Thank you so very much. I know that Tia had been answering a lot of the questions that came up and was sharing a lot of the great.
I'm still ready. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
I also was going to open with acknowledging Anne and Marcia. Anne is the daughter-in-law of Peggy, and Marcia is the daughter of Peggy, and they've just been sending me tidbits the entire time. Some really intimate details as well as, structural about the house. Like,
Wow.
that fireplace is not original. So I have learned so much. And if you, Anne or Marcia, you want me to connect you with Dr. Jeff, please just send me your email.
We have your contact info from when you registered, so no need to put that
here. I want to
here.
make sure that it's the same email, because sometimes in the back. Anyway, so
oh no, I just don't want you to give your email to everybody in the room. That's what I'm saying.
Sometimes they have multiple emails. It's the future. Okay, so first up we have Linda. Linda asked if we've been in touch with the owner of the house now, and if we are aware that the owner of the house actively campaigned to stop the town of Clarence from passing a local preservation law.
Yep. So we've reached out and sent things to that owner. I certainly don't want to get in, we have not met or spoken with this woman, so we're not aware of the people that own the house, but we have sent the full information that we've submitted to SHPO for them to peruse and consider, and an invitation to meet and speak with us. So we certainly look forward to speaking to them, to not only, as part of our ongoing process with the end goal of listing this on the National Register, but certainly, in general preservation needs, this is a 200-year-old house. The town of Clarence does have a preservation commission that can certainly give information and advice, but Jeff and I are certainly here to advise, wanting to make sure that that house stays part of our built environment into the future. So hopefully looking forward to speaking to the owner soon.
All right, and then we're going to move on to Glenn. Glenn has a lot of technical questions. So the first one is, what alterations did Peggy make to the property? Obviously, other than the fireplace, which we now know.
Well, she didn't do the fireplace. I think the fireplace was added much later, or we'll need to talk to our relatives to confirm that. But architecturally speaking, from architectural historian point of view, we aren't aware of any major alterations that Peggy did herself. We know Jeff brought up briefly from the quotes that there were many instances where Peggy had, rocks or other items thrown through her windows. And so in the letters and the papers where she describes that process and explains it, just the slight references of how she described getting those windows repaired and stuff implies to us that those were still wood windows when she was living in the house. Some of those windows have subsequently been replaced. So I think all of those major changes that have been done to the house have been in after her ownership. So really, I think we're looking at the integrity of that building was, she was pretty much living in the house as it was built, finished building in the 1880s. I know that Jeff has looked at the letters much more detail than I have, where she does kind of explain some of the references to the things inside the house and the layout and some of those original elements and how much she loved them. And she was a craftsman herself. So we know that she took time to repair, restore, maintain those original elements. So to all the research that we have available, we don't see that there were any major alterations done to the property by Peggy herself.
Okay, and what is the NRHP period of significance? Were other periods of the property's history cited as significant?
Yes, so currently right now in the paperwork that we submitted to the State Preservation Office, our period of significance is fluid at this moment, because again, we need some more documentation from the earliest history to really confirm that construction date. But ideally, that period of significance is going to be from its construction date in the 1800s, whenever that was, through her death in 2000. So that is our period of significance that we're searching, applying under, because again, for those who don't know what period of significance mean, it's going to relate to that time period that, the significance you're saying meets those criteria. That is the time period that bookends that significance, that history. So for us, yes, we definitely think it's significant because of its earlier history before Peggy got there, and because of its architecture, and then certainly because of Peggy herself and the work that she did there. So that period of significance is going to be much broader than if we were just nominating it for its architecture or for its early history. That period of significance would be smaller because it would be based around that information. But we're definitely looking for a much broader period of significance. But again, where we are in that process is that we have made our claims and our arguments of this is what we think the period of significance is, this is what we think the criteria that it's eligible under and for what and why. And so now we're waiting to hear back from SHPO if they have further questions about the research and information we've provided them, if maybe they think it should be even wider, or maybe it should be smaller. So we're still in that review process with SHPO on it.
And please describe dialogue with SHPO and whether or not any thematic New York State research adds to the understanding of the property. What about public hearings? Also a suggestion here, summarize NRHP process and refocus on what is happening now. There's a hunt for LGBT associated resources regarding applicable NRHP criteria. I'm sure.
Yes. Oh yeah. I mean, we love having, I think definitely we should say that for tonight's purposes, we definitely kind of boiled down all the information and wanted to create, a more simpler project, not, that would be accessible to everyone, independent of how much they knew about preservation. So we definitely watered down stuff and omitted some things. So definitely in the future, we'd love to have a more detailed, as far as general conversations about the National Register process and information about that, make sure to head to our website to check our calendar, because we do have a couple of workshops and lectures coming up that's going to speak more broadly about those projects. But specifically to SHPO's reaction, and their view of this nomination, Jeff and I met with some representatives from SHPO earlier in the year after the last presentation that we had on LBGTQ sites here in Western New York. And I think it's okay for us to say that SHPO was very enthused based on the research that we have, Jeff has uncovered, and realizing the wealth of LBGTQ sites that exist here. I think that we all understand, and to what Glenn was saying about the hunt for LBGTQ sites, I think we all realize that this has been a hidden history. And so wanting to make sure that we elevate those narratives. So I think that our New York State SHPO is definitely eager to highlight as many of those stories as possible, and are definitely excited about the work that we're doing here in Western New York to elevate these narratives. I mean, something Jeff and I talk about often and in the field talk about often is how the larger coastal cities, the big cities, often get most of the attention when it comes to LGBTQ history and advocacy. And I think that our research here is really showing how it's the smaller places, the rural places, we're doing groundbreaking work too. And so SHPO is very eager to hear and learn about those sites. And I'm talking a lot, Jeff, you can jump in anytime.
I expected Jeff to just jump in there. I don't know why. Andrew asks, is there anything anyone can do to help with the preservation of the home?
I mean, right now, quiet and peaceful admiration from the public right of way is definitely within your ability. Coming to events like this, whether they're PBN events or other organizations highlighting whether it's LGBTQ history or other hidden histories, definitely contributes to the overall work to preserve and protect these spaces. The more we're aware of these histories and these locations, the more apt we are to be able to protect them in the future. So those are definitely the things that you could be doing today. And then kicking it up a notch, financially supporting organizations like PBN that are doing this work would help. Because again, Jeff and I, we're doing this all ourselves. We're working with wonderful resources and repositories that have this information, but this is day to day digging in archives, reading documents, and pulling up this history. And so funding is definitely needed to support those things.
And that is it for right now. I don't see any other questions, but if anyone wants to fire one off, 3, 2, 1. Otherwise, Christy.
And can I just say one, because Dan did comment, Dan DeLandro from the Madeline Davis Archives from SUNY Buffalo State. I know that he commented and Tia shared that, but Jeff, all of this work is very dependent on the resources in that archives. So thank you very much, Dan, for your wonderful stewardship of those resources and allowing us to access them. So definitely check out their website and be able to navigate and view those sources yourself. Excellent.
I just wanted to jump in because I was reading back through the chat and specifically thank Anne and Marcia, and and I know who you are from researching Peggy. So it's just like blowing my mind a bit that you're here, and Marcia in particular, I've read your correspondence with Peggy that you mentioned in the chat, right? And so I would love to talk to you at some point, right? Of course, history is all an interpretation, right? So I'm working from the sources that I've had available thus far, mainly Peggy's papers. Right, but I would love to talk to both of you if you're willing to speak with me, right? And I do also want to emphasize, to the point that Marcia made, right, about there's very little support for us as her family, and we all did struggle. I think it's so important for us to keep in mind that this was the 70s when she transitioned, and how different things are between then and now, and how little information, right, there was out there, and that, right, that must have really come as a shock, right? And there's that other important side of the story too, in terms of, right, what did the person who was transitioning, what did they experience, but then also what was the experience like for their family and loved ones. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, definitely. It's a whole, I mean, it's not that long ago, but it's a whole different ball game now. There are dozens of, many organizations that just pop up to be able to help everyone on the family, not just in the actual transitioning portion of it or whatnot. With that, thank you so very much to everyone who attended. All of the questions were great. Again, incredibly wonderful to have the opportunity to speak to the family members and future conversations with you guys. Thank you so very much. And with that, we will close out this evening. Have a great night. Make sure, now that you've registered for this event, you're on our email list. So you'll see future events. Jeff and I definitely have a couple of more Lbgtq themed lectures coming up into the summer. So keep an eye out for those. And with that, thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.